Have you ever wondered how an empire as mighty as Rome could just disappear? The truth is, it didn't. There wasn't a single cataclysmic event or one final, glorious battle. The story of Rome's fall is more like a long, slow sunset than a sudden explosion. It was a story of gradual decay, almost invisible to those living through it. From the first godlike emperors to the last desperate rulers clinging to power, Rome was a fragile dance of authority, tradition, and belief. While legions still marched and laws were still passed, the very fabric of the empire was quietly wearing thin. Its power faded, but its soul lived on. The influence of Rome outlasted its legions, surviving in our languages, our laws, and our collective memory. This is the story of how an empire didn't fall, but simply drifted off to sleep. Have you ever imagined the fall of Rome? A city in flames, barbarians at the gates, a civilization crumbling overnight. That's the story we're often told. But what if I told you it's a myth? The real story is far more unsettling, because Rome didn't fall with a final, earth-shattering scream. It faded away, slowly, while everyone was still living inside it, still obeying its laws, still proudly calling themselves Romans. Imagine being there at the beginning. Rome feels eternal. Emperors come and go, some wise, some cruel. But the idea of Rome itself, it's as solid as the marble columns of the Forum. It's an unquestioned truth, heavy with certainty. The roads stretch farther than anyone can remember. The laws outlive the very people who wrote them. The armies march not just to conquer, but to remind the world that Rome is order itself. To be Roman is to belong to something that doesn't end. The emperors weren't kings like in the old stories. They were something else entirely. They were caretakers of an illusion, an idea much larger than themselves. Each one inherited not just power, but a heavy expectation, the belief that Rome must continue, no matter the cost. Some ruled with discipline, others with cruelty, some with sheer exhaustion. But in the end, they were all trapped inside the same vast, complex machine. Their job wasn't just to rule, but to preserve the feeling that Rome was forever. Now, here's the twist, the decline. When it started, actually looked a lot like success. The empire expanded so fast it became impossible to govern effectively. Wealth poured into the city, but it was a distorted, imbalanced wealth that created new problems. Senators, once statesmen, were now just competing for influence. The armies, the very backbone of Rome, started becoming loyal to their generals, not to the idea of Rome itself. The emperors found themselves spending more time just trying to prevent collapse than actually building stability. Of course, nobody admitted this out loud. It was a silent, creeping crisis. Rome became busy, incredibly busy. Administration multiplied. Bureaucracy thickened until it was a suffocating blanket. New laws were written to fix problems that were caused by older laws. Think about that for a second. The system was patching itself with more of itself. Emperors issued decrees from distant, luxurious palaces, trusting a long chain of messengers, governors, and soldiers to interpret their will correctly. On paper, their authority was absolute. In reality, it was incredibly fragile, stretched thin across thousands of miles. Back in the capital city, the people grew restless. The old Republican ideal of civic participation was long gone. Now, what mattered was bread and circuses. The crowds didn't rule anymore, but they still had to be managed. The emperors learned that peace and quiet in the streets had a daily price tag: food, entertainment, and the constant promise that Rome would always provide. But when that provision faltered, even for a moment, fear followed like a shadow. An empty grain shipment could cause more panic than a distant rebellion. And what about those distant rebellions? Beyond the city, the borders were stretched dangerously thin. Legions of soldiers guarded rivers, deserts, and forests that never truly felt like they belonged to Rome. These soldiers often lived their entire lives far from the capital, defending an idea they had never experienced firsthand. Their world was the barracks, their commander, and the men fighting beside them. So, loyalty began to shift, quietly but surely. It moved from the Senate to the emperor, from the emperor to the general, and finally, from the idea of Rome to the simple, brutal reality of survival. Time seemed to move differently then. It crawled along for decades, then suddenly lurched forward. A good emperor would come along and spend his entire reign repairing the damage left by a bad one. Then, a bad emperor would undo years of careful work in just a few months. Assassinations became a disturbingly routine part of politics. The line of succession became a chaotic, bloody scramble. Stability wasn't a given anymore. It was a temporary, fleeting luxury. And yet, through all of this, Rome continued. The machine kept running. Because decline doesn't announce itself with a trumpet blast. It disguises itself as routine. It's the tax collector who still comes to your door. It's the courts that are still open for business. It's the legions that are still marching under the eagle standard. People still woke up, went to work, ate their meals, and slept under the same familiar symbols of Roman power. They didn't see a collapsing empire. They saw life just as it had always been. Maybe a little harder, a little more uncertain, but still Roman. Rome didn't collapse in a single, fiery moment. It adapted itself into weakness. It hollowed itself out from the inside until there was nothing left but a shell. The idea of Rome survived long after the power was gone. That's the truly chilling part of the story. The end wasn't an event, it was a process. It was a long, slow fade into history, happening right under the noses of the people who thought they were living at the center of the world forever. It is a powerful reminder that even the greatest things don't always end with a bang, but with a quiet, drawn-out whisper. For centuries, the title of Roman emperor remained the same, but the men who held it, and the very purpose of their rule, began to change. Early emperors, like Augustus or Trajan, genuinely believed they were sculpting the future of Rome, building an empire for the ages. But as time went on, this ambition faded. Later emperors weren't builders, they were managers. Their days weren't filled with grand visions of conquest or prosperity, but with the relentless, grinding task of just holding it all together. Imagine being the CEO of a company that's too big to fail, but also too big to fix. That was the late Roman emperor. Their entire focus was on management, managing armies on distant frontiers, managing corrupt or incompetent governors, managing civil unrest bubbling up in the cities, and managing the crushing weight of public expectation. Power, once a tool for creation, became a shield for defense. Emperors spent their entire reigns not creating a golden age, but simply trying to prevent the next disaster. Any reforms they managed to pass were like sticking a plaster on a gaping wound. Temporary. Any military victories were often just symbolic, designed to boost morale rather than secure a lasting peace. Stability was a fragile illusion, lasting only until the next succession crisis inevitably erupted. Each new emperor inherited a set of problems that were already too big to solve. They would struggle, patch things up as best they could, and then pass on the same problems, just a little bit worse, to the next guy. It was a cycle of managed decline. The empire's immense size, once its greatest source of pride, had become its heaviest burden. Think about it. In a world without instant communication, how do you rule a territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia? Messages traveled at the speed of a horse or a ship. An urgent report of an invasion might take weeks to reach the emperor, and his orders would take just as long to get back. By the time a command arrived, the situation on the ground could be completely different. This communication lag had a profound effect. Governors in far-flung provinces began to act with near-total independence. Some were responsible and governed well. Others were ruthless tyrants, enriching themselves at the expense of the local population. These local elites, the wealthy landowners and merchants, became very skilled at playing a double game. They learned to speak the language of Roman authority, paying lip service to the emperor, while secretly pursuing their own agendas. Roman authority was stretched so thin across this vast expanse that it often snapped silently. A province might functionally break away, but as long as the statues were polished and the taxes were sent, mostly nobody in the capital would notice or care, until it was too late. The heart of Roman power, the army, was also transforming. The legendary legions of the Republic, made up of citizen soldiers defending their homeland, were a distant memory. The new army was a professional force. These soldiers weren't fighting for an abstract idea of Rome. They were fighting for their pay, for their commanders, and for the routine of military life. Their loyalty wasn't to the Senate or the people, but to the general who could guarantee their salary and lead them to victory and plunder. This shifted the entire political landscape. An emperor who couldn't pay his troops simply didn't rule for very long. If the money ran out, the soldiers would find someone who could pay them, and that someone would become the new emperor. Assassination stopped being a shocking act of treason and became a grimly accepted method of political correction. It was how the system rebooted itself, and this led to a monumental change in perception. The emperor was no longer a sacred, divinely chosen figure. He was replaceable. Once that belief took root among the military and the political class, the institution of the emperor lost its gravity, its mystique. Rulers came and went with bewildering speed. Some reigned for only a few months before being murdered by their own guards. How could anyone build genuine loyalty, or even fear, towards a man who might be dead by next season. The office of emperor remained, but the men who occupied it became fleeting, disposable figures. As the emperors became more preoccupied with military matters on the frontiers, the city of Rome itself began to lose its importance. Symbolically, it was still the heart of the world, the eternal city, but practically, emperors started ruling from wherever the crises were. They set up imperial courts in cities closer to the action: Milan in Italy, Trier in Germany, Nicomedia in modern-day Turkey, and eventually, the great new capital of Constantinople. The entire imperial administration, the bureaucracy that ran the empire, followed them. Rome, the city, became a living museum. It was still inhabited, still magnificent, but it was revered more as a memory than relied upon as a functioning capital. Beneath the surface of all this political and military turmoil, the economic foundations of the empire were quietly crumbling. To pay the ever more demanding army, emperors resorted to debasing the currency. They would mint new coins with less and less actual silver in them. People weren't stupid. They knew the money was worth less, so prices for everything skyrocketed. Inflation ran rampant. The complex trade routes that had been the arteries of the empire began to falter. Piracy and banditry increased as the state's ability to police the seas and roads weakened. Out in the countryside, life became increasingly precarious. Farmers, who formed the backbone of the economy, abandoned their land because it no longer offered them a secure living. Why toil away when your crops could be seized by desperate tax collectors or looted by passing soldiers? And the tax collection itself became a brutal, desperate affair. The state demanded more and more from its citizens, while offering less and less security in return. It was a vicious cycle. So, how did people cope? They adapted. They had to. Communities turned inward, becoming more self-reliant. The local strong man, the wealthy landowner with his private militia, became far more important to the average person's survival than some distant, anonymous official in a faraway court. For millions of people, the primary concern was no longer about being a good Roman citizen. It was simply about survival. The grand structure of the empire still existed on paper, but on the ground, it was experienced in 1,000 different ways. In some regions, Roman control was still strong. In others, it was little more than a ghost, a faded memory. And yet, despite all of this, the illusion of a single, eternal Roman Empire endured. Laws were still issued in the emperor's name. Grand statues were still raised in his honor. Oaths of loyalty were still sworn. The official language of government and propaganda continued to speak of eternal victory and unbreakable power, even as reality contradicted it every single day. This is the truly fascinating part. The fall of Rome wasn't a single event, like a building collapsing in an earthquake. It was a slow, gradual hollowing out. Rome learned to live with its own decline. It wasn't experienced as a daily catastrophe, but as a chronic condition, a new normal. The world was changing, power was fracturing, and the empire was fading, not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whisper. And for the people living through it, this slow decay was simply the way the world was. The story of an empire's end is rarely a single, dramatic event. It's a slow unraveling, a series of choices made out of necessity, not desire. For Rome, the end began with an admission. After centuries of believing in its own indivisible might, the empire finally accepted a truth it had long resisted. It could no longer be whole. Division wasn't surrender, it was a desperate strategy. One emperor became two. Power was cleaved between East and West, not because the ideal of unity had failed, but because the practice of it had become impossible. The sheer scale of the empire, the slowness of communication, and the constant eruption of crises along its vast frontiers demanded a new approach. A ruler needed to be close to the fire. So, they split the map. Each half still called itself Rome. Each believed, or at least pretended to believe, that the other was just a temporary measure. And for a while, it seemed to work. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its wealthy cities, bustling trade routes, and more defensible borders, found a new stability. It was more urban, more organized, more resilient. The West, by contrast, was a different story. It was vast, largely rural, and dangerously exposed on multiple fronts. Here, the emperors became nomads, ruling not from a single grand capital, but from military camps and frontier cities. Wherever the danger was greatest, the capital of the Western Roman Empire was, in effect, wherever the emperor stood with his army. This constant state of emergency forced radical change. An emperor named Diocletian, a man of iron will, attempted to bolt the decaying structure back together. He completely reorganized the administration, creating a complex web of bureaucracy to manage every facet of life. He multiplied the number of provinces, hoping smaller units would be easier to control. He fixed prices by law, trying to combat runaway inflation. He demanded absolute obedience. The empire hardened. The distinction between a citizen and a subject blurred, then vanished. Your job wasn't a choice. It was an inheritance. Your son would be a baker because you were a baker. Order was restored, but it was the rigid order of a state that ruled by coercion, not consent. Stability had returned, but it was a brittle, fragile thing. The state itself became a crushing weight upon its people, to pay for the massive army and the sprawling bureaucracy. Taxes soared to unbearable levels. Every aspect of commerce was tangled in red tape. In this new Rome, freedom wasn't taken in a single stroke. It simply withered away, quietly, in the shadow of regulation. People survived by keeping their heads down and complying. The trust that had once bound the empire together was gone. The state no longer trusted its people, and the people had no reason to trust the state. Then, into this vacuum of belief, a new force emerged, a faith that had once been persecuted, driven underground, and met with brutal suppression, began to ascend. Christianity. First it was tolerated. Then, with Emperor Constantine, it was embraced. The emperor's power was no longer just a matter of law and military might. It was now backed by divine favor. The empire sought a new kind of unity and shared faith, hoping to mend the political fractures that had torn it apart. This shift brought solace to millions, but it also created new divisions. The old gods, the pantheon that had watched over Rome for 1,000 years, began to fade into myth. Temples were repurposed or abandoned. New loyalties, centered on bishops and believers, began to compete with old loyalties to the state. The empire had found a new spiritual language, but it hadn't solved its fundamental problems. It was still too big, too expensive, and too threatened. In the West, the pressures were relentless. The frontiers, once formidable, began to buckle. Germanic groups, people the Romans collectively called barbarians, crossed the borders. They weren't always invading armies in the classic sense. Many came as refugees, seeking land and safety. Others came as allies, recruited to defend the very borders they were crossing. Rome, desperate for soldiers to fill its depleted legions, made a trade, land and a place within the empire in exchange for military service. And so, the outsiders slowly became insiders. The lines of identity, once so clear, began to blur. Who was a Roman now? Was it the farmer in Gaul whose family had lived there for generations, or the Gothic general commanding a Roman army, wearing a Roman title, and defending the empire from other newcomers? Rome adapted, as it always had. Barbarian warlords held high office. Roman laws were still on the books, but whether they were enforced depended on the local strongman, not on a distant emperor. And yet, through all this fragmentation, people still called themselves Roman. Even as the political structure of the Western Empire crumbled and fell away, the idea of Rome survived. To be Roman was never truly about bloodlines or ethnicity. It was about living within a shared system of laws, language, and culture. That system was now a ghost, its authority gone, but its habits, its memories, and its name remained. This incredible adaptability, this ability to absorb and transform, had always been Rome's greatest strength. In the end, it was also its final weakness, as the idea of Rome became a hollowed-out shell, too fragile to contain the turbulent new world being born within it. How does an empire die? Not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fade. The end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a single, cataclysmic event. It was a gradual unraveling, a decade-by-decade transformation that was so slow, most people living through it might not have even noticed they were witnessing the end of an era. Imagine you're living in Gaul, or Britain, or Hispania in the 4th or 5th century. You wouldn't wake up one morning to find the empire gone. Instead, you'd notice small changes. The mail service, the famous cursus publicus, becomes less reliable. Letters from relatives in other provinces take longer to arrive, or don't arrive at all. The magnificent Roman roads, the arteries of the empire, start to show their age. Potholes aren't filled as quickly. Bridges fall into disrepair and stay that way. Then you'd notice the economy shifting. The once stable gold solidus coin becomes harder to find. More and more, you're trading goods directly, a sack of grain for a new pair of shoes. Tax collectors who used to be a predictable part of life now either don't show up for years, or they arrive with a brutal armed escort demanding back taxes in a way that feels more like a shakedown than official business. What about security? The legions, the symbol of Roman power, are stretched thin. Garrisons on the frontiers shrink. Soldiers are pulled away to fight in yet another civil war for an emperor you've never seen. The protection you once took for granted becomes inconsistent. Suddenly, local security is your own problem. Your community starts looking not to a distant emperor in Ravenna or Rome, but to the closest powerful figure, a local landowner, with his own private army, a charismatic bishop who can organize the community, or a barbarian general who has settled nearby. Power, once centralized and abstract, is now local and very, very personal. This is a key part of the story. The empire didn't just break, it dissolved. Authority seeped downwards. In your town, the Roman magistrate might still be there, but his real power is dwarfed by the local strongman. Roman law is still cited in disputes, but it's interpreted and enforced by these new local powers, often blended with local customs. The emperor's name might still be stamped on official documents, a ghost of a former authority, but his actual influence on your daily life is practically zero. And what about the so-called barbarian invasions? We often picture hordes of savages swarming over the walls, burning everything in sight. While that did happen in some places, the reality was often far more complicated. Many of these invasions were actually migrations. Groups like the Goths, Franks, and Vandals weren't just looking to plunder. They were looking for a home, for land, for security, for a piece of the Roman dream. For centuries, Rome had managed these groups by absorbing them. It would settle a tribe on the frontier, grant its leader a Roman title like general, and give them the job of defending the border. They became part of the system. But in its later years, the empire was too weak to enforce this deal. It would give a Gothic leader a title and land, but it no longer had the strength to ensure his loyalty. These new groups were Roman in name, but their allegiance was to their own people and their own leaders. The lines blurred between immigrant and invader, between Roman general and barbarian warlord. Often, they were the same person. The heart of the empire, the city of Rome itself, slowly faded from relevance. It had once been the center of the known world, a megacity of over 1 million people. By the 5th century, the emperors rarely even lived there. The court had moved to places like Milan or Ravenna, closer to the critical frontiers. Rome became a living museum, a symbol of a glorious past. The Senate still met, its aristocratic members clinging to ancient traditions, but the real power was long gone. So when Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city in 410, the shock was profound, but it was mostly emotional. It was like learning a beloved, elderly grandparent had been mugged. It was tragic and sacrilegious, but it didn't fundamentally change the day-to-day reality for most people in the provinces. The empire had been functioning without Rome for a long time. The world didn't end, it just kept adjusting. This is the final, crucial point. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse into a dark age of total chaos. It transformed. It was like a grand, decaying building being disassembled, its stones and timbers reused to build smaller, local structures. The administrative regions of the empire became the outlines of new kingdoms. A Frankish king in Gaul would use Roman tax systems, Roman legal ideas, and even call himself by a Roman title. Bishops took over the civic duties once held by Roman governors, their dioceses often matching the old Roman administrative boundaries perfectly. Latin didn't vanish. It evolved into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. Roman law became the foundation for medieval legal codes. Even the roads, though decayed, continued to be used, shaping trade routes for centuries to come. The legacy of Rome was so immense that it became the basic software for the new civilizations of Europe. People continued living with Roman habits, Roman ideas, and in a landscape shaped by Rome. Long after the last Western Roman emperor was quietly deposed in 476, the empire died, but it also became immortal. It ceased to be a political reality, but it lived on as an idea, a memory, and a foundation. It's a story not of a sudden death, but of a long, slow, and strangely familiar afterlife. The center was gone, but the pieces were all still there, just rearranged into a new pattern. When we think about the fall of Rome, what image comes to mind? Is it a city in flames, sacked by barbarians? Is it a dramatic, final battle where an empire breathes its last? For centuries, that's the story we've been told. A sudden, catastrophic end. But the truth is far less dramatic, and infinitely more fascinating. The real story isn't about how Rome fell, but how it simply faded away. By the time the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 AD, there wasn't much of an empire left to fall. Picture this: the emperor, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus, wasn't a mighty ruler commanding legions from a grand palace. He was more like a figurehead, controlling a sliver of Italy, completely at the mercy of his own generals. These generals weren't loyal to some abstract idea of Rome. Their loyalty was to the soldiers who paid their salaries and followed their orders. The title of emperor was kept around not because it held any real power, but because it provided a sense of legitimacy, a link to a glorious past. Getting rid of the emperor seemed almost pointless because he wasn't in charge of anything anymore. He didn't direct events. Events just happened around him. So, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer finally told this boy emperor to step down, what happened? Did the world stop? Did cities burn in protest? Did the entire system collapse overnight? No, absolutely nothing. Life just went on. The complex machinery of Roman administration didn't grind to a halt. It just got a new manager. Taxes were still collected, maybe by a guy with a different title, but they were collected. The laws that governed daily life were still applied. People woke up the next day and went about their business. The transition was so smooth, so quiet, that most people living at the time probably didn't even notice that the Roman Empire had fallen. This wasn't a sudden death. It was more like a corporate takeover, where the old brand is slowly phased out. The end of Rome wasn't a bang, it was a whisper. It wasn't an act of destruction, but an act of replacement. But here's the crucial part of the story that often gets overlooked. While the West was undergoing this quiet transformation, the Roman Empire wasn't gone at all. It was thriving, just in a different place, in the East. The city of Constantinople stood as the proud capital of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, but they never called themselves that. To them, they were simply Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor, a direct successor to Augustus and Constantine. They preserved Roman law, they perfected Roman bureaucracy, and they carried the torch of Roman civilization for another 1,000 years. The emperors in Constantinople never for a moment thought they were something new or different. They were ruling Rome, long after the city of Rome itself had become a provincial backwater. This Eastern continuity is essential to understanding the whole picture. The idea of Rome was alive and well, a powerful, functioning state that would shape the history of Europe and the Middle East for centuries to come. The fall of the West was just one chapter in a much, much longer book. So what happened to the idea of being Roman in the West? It just slowly dissolved. As central authority vanished, people's identities began to shrink. You were no longer a citizen of a vast, continent-spanning empire. You were a citizen of your town. Your loyalty belonged to the local warlord or bishop who could actually protect you and your family. People stopped calling themselves Romans not out of protest, but because it just stopped being practical. It didn't mean anything in their daily lives anymore. Your identity became tied to where you lived. You were a Gaul, a Briton, a Hispano-Roman. Power had moved from a distant, abstract emperor to someone you could see, someone whose authority was immediate and real. Loyalty had narrowed from the empire to the region, from the abstract to the tangible. This localization of identity was the true fall of Roman culture in the West. It wasn't a rejection of Rome, but an adaptation to a world where Rome was no longer the center of gravity. And yet, even as it faded, Rome remained everywhere, like a ghost haunting the new world that was being built on its foundations. Its legacy was so powerful, so immense, that it was impossible to escape. The Catholic Church, which became the single most powerful institution in post-Roman Europe, preserved Latin as the language of scholarship, religion, and diplomacy for 1,000 years. Every time a priest said Mass, he was speaking the language of Caesar, the new barbarian kings who carved up the Western Empire. The Franks, the Goths, the Vandals didn't try to erase Rome. They tried to imitate it. They adopted Roman titles like consul or patrician. They issued coins with the emperor's face on them. Even long after the emperors were gone, they based their new law codes on the sophisticated structure of Roman law. Even those who claimed to be replacing Rome couldn't imagine a world without its framework. Charlemagne, hundreds of years later, would call his vast kingdom the Holy Roman Empire, a desperate and powerful attempt to resurrect the very idea of Rome. They couldn't build a future without borrowing heavily from the past. This is why we can say Rome's decline was endless. Its political power in the West might have dissolved, but its influence became woven into the very DNA of Western civilization. It didn't die, it dispersed. It became the foundation for everything that came after: our languages, our laws, our religions, our architecture, our ideas about government. Its legacy is so pervasive that we often don't even see it, like the air we breathe. This is the quiet, profound truth of all great, long-lasting empires. They don't truly end with a climactic battle or a signed treaty. They end when they become so fundamental, so integrated into the fabric of what comes next, that they become invisible. They stop being a place on a map and start being an idea in the minds of millions. Rome didn't fall. It became the bedrock upon which the modern world was built. Have you ever pictured the fall of Rome? Do you see smoke, fire, and barbarian hordes storming the gates? It's a dramatic image, but the reality was far quieter, more subtle, and in many ways, more fascinating. By the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, the grand structures we imagine had become more formal than functional. Think of it less like a fortress being stormed and more like a massive, ancient tree slowly hollowing out from the inside. Emperors still wore the purple robes and held the titles, but their authority was often symbolic. The real power had fragmented, shifting to governors, generals, and local strongmen scattered across the vast territories. The empire wasn't a single, coherent force anymore. It was more like a collection of networks, personal agreements, and ingrained habits. The intricate system of roads, aqueducts, and cities, the marvels of Roman engineering, still functioned, but the central nervous system that connected them all was fraying. The coherence that had once bound this immense civilization together was slowly, almost imperceptibly, loosening its grip. Day-to-day life continued, but with a growing sense of unpredictability. The economy and administration persisted, but they were patchy. Taxes were still collected, but often late or only in part. Goods still flowed along the Mediterranean trade routes, but the threat of piracy and disruption was ever present, making every voyage a gamble. The legendary Roman legions still marched, their armor gleaming, but sometimes they marched for their own generals, for their own ambitions, rather than for the emperor or the idea of Rome. Centralized military strategy gave way to local defense. Communities began to look inward, relying on whoever could offer protection and stability right there, right then. Whether it was a local landowner with a private militia or a charismatic bishop. Yet, even as Roman authority waned, Roman habits endured. People still thought of themselves as Roman, followed Roman laws, and lived in Roman-style cities. This is the great paradox of the late empire. The final emperors in the West found themselves ruling over smaller and smaller territories, their power shrinking with each passing year. They became dependent on generals whose loyalty was personal, not institutional. A general was loyal to the man who paid him, not to the abstract concept of the state. Succession, once a structured process, became a chaotic game of survival. You became emperor not by divine right or senate approval, but by having the strongest army and the sharpest instincts. So when the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustus, was quietly deposed in 476 AD, it was almost an afterthought. There was no epic final battle, no city burned to the ground in defiance. No legions made a last stand. For most people, it was just another Tuesday. Governance simply adapted. Life went on. The empire had faded so gradually that its final breath was barely noticed. It was like a candle that had been dimming for months, not one snuffed out in an instant. But this was only half the story. Over in the east, in the magnificent city of Constantinople, the Roman Empire was very much alive and well. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, preserved the intricate bureaucracy, the complex legal codes, and the powerful Roman identity. Their emperors still called themselves Roman, and they had every right to. They maintained the ancient traditions, the elaborate court rituals, and the administrative structures that had made Rome great. They extended the life of the empire for another 1,000 years, a living, breathing testament to Roman resilience. The East became a living memory of what the West had gradually lost, a constant reminder that the idea of Rome could endure, even when its original heartland had dissolved into a patchwork of new kingdoms. And yet, even in the supposedly fallen West, Rome lingered like a ghost. It wasn't gone. It had just transformed. The Christian Church, which had grown within the empire, adopted its administrative structure, with dioceses mirroring Roman provinces. The new barbarian kings who carved out kingdoms from Roman territory didn't want to destroy Romanness. They wanted to inherit it. They borrowed Roman titles, minted coins with the emperor's image, and sought legitimacy through Roman traditions. Latin, the language of the conquerors, remained the language of law, of learning, and of religion for centuries to come. It was the common tongue that united educated people across a fragmented Europe. Even where the ultimate authority had changed hands, the memory of Rome shaped everything. It shaped behavior, beliefs, and expectations. People still lived in Roman cities, walked on Roman roads, and organized their communities based on Roman models. The empire's decline wasn't a collapse, it was a diffusion. It was like a powerful dye that had bled into the fabric of Europe, its colors still visible everywhere. This quiet, slow decline teaches us something profound about power and civilization. Empires don't always end with a bang. They often end with a whisper, through endless negotiation, adaptation, and habituation. Formal power fades, but its influence remains, embedded in the culture. Authority becomes abstract, a distant memory, yet it continues to shape the lives of millions. Civilization carries on in the structures, the laws, the roads, and the rituals, long after the men and the titles that created them are gone. In this sense, Rome never truly disappeared. Its decline was endless, imperceptible, and almost invisible. It flowed into the foundations of a new Europe and a new Mediterranean world. Life went on. People adapted. The empire they had once served gradually, piece by piece, became a memory, a story, a legend. You could say that Rome is asleep, but its presence is still felt all around us. Its direct authority vanished, but its influence endured. Its decline is measured not in battles won or lost, but in the persistence of habit, the echo of law, and the quiet continuity of culture. And that is how the Western Roman Empire truly fell, not with a single night of fire and fury, but with centuries of slow, almost invisible fading. It left behind a world that was still, in its bones, very much Roman. Long after Rome itself had stopped arriving, history often paints the fall of Rome as a single, cataclysmic event, a dramatic collapse with fire, smoke, and barbarian hordes at the gates. But the truth is far quieter, more complex, and perhaps more relatable. This wasn't a sudden death, it was a slow, almost imperceptible fade. Let's explore how the Western Roman Empire ended, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Imagine being one of the last Western Roman emperors. Your life isn't about glorious conquests or expanding the borders of civilization. Instead, your days are an endless grind of administration. You're wrestling with problems that are simply too vast for any one person to solve. The frontiers are collapsing. Your armies are loyal to their generals, not to you. And the great cities are crumbling from neglect. Your job is to maintain the illusion of power. You spend your time buried in correspondence, conducting inspections, and participating in grand ceremonies, all designed to remind everyone that Rome still exists, even as the reality grows weaker by the day. In this landscape, power became deeply personal. The old structures of authority were hollowing out. Generals, many from outside the traditional Roman aristocracy, held the real power. Their soldiers weren't loyal to the concept of Rome or the emperor on his distant throne. They were loyal to the man who paid them, who fought alongside them, and who promised them land and rewards. Emperors found they could no longer simply command. They had to negotiate constantly. They used titles as bargaining chips, wealth as a reward, and promises as leverage to maintain a fragile grip on territories that were never truly under their control. It was a constant, exhausting balancing act. And yet, amid this political decay, Roman culture persisted with surprising strength. The empire's legacy was woven into the fabric of daily life. Latin remained the language of law, of government, of literature, and of the increasingly influential Christian church. People continued to participate in public festivals and rituals, not necessarily out of fervent belief in the emperor's divine right, but out of habit, tradition, and a quiet sense that continuity was better than the chaos of change. These traditions provided a sense of stability, a familiar rhythm in an uncertain world. Even the city of Rome itself, the once unbeaten heart of the empire, had become a shadow of its former glory. It was now a symbolic center, a living museum. Emperors rarely visited, preferring administrative hubs closer to the troubled frontiers. The Senate still met, its members clinging to ancient traditions, but they wielded little real power. The city's magnificent infrastructure was in slow decline. Aqueducts leaked, great walls crumbled, and the majestic temples faded. Yet, the idea of Rome was as powerful as ever. People across the known world still called themselves Romans, and the city remained the ultimate standard against which all other places were measured. The famous Roman borders, once so rigidly defined and defended, had become porous and fluid. Germanic groups, Huns, and others, often labeled barbarians, were no longer just outside threats. They were moving in, sometimes as invaders, but often as foederati allies and settlers integrated into the empire's own systems. Their presence was a constant test of Rome's ability to adapt. In some regions, this integration was a success, creating vibrant, hybrid communities that blended Roman law with new customs. In others, it created simmering, low-level conflict that slowly, quietly, weakened the empire's foundations from within. This wasn't the epic war of Hollywood, movies. It was a gradual, messy process of cultural and demographic change. The empire's economy and administration shifted from being proactive to purely reactive. Collecting taxes became an inconsistent and desperate affair. The government repeatedly debased its own currency, mixing precious metals with cheaper ones, just to meet its financial obligations, which in turn fueled inflation and instability. Trade routes that had once been the arteries of the empire became more dangerous, plagued by insecurity and piracy. Farming communities were squeezed from all sides, pressured by imperial tax collectors and raiding groups alike. For the average person, life was about constant adaptation, a daily struggle to survive that was largely invisible to the historians who chronicled the lives of emperors and the outcomes of battles. Through it all, the emperors retained their ritual power. The machine of imperial propaganda kept running. Crowds still cheered during their staged appearances. Coins minted with their faces still circulated, a tangible reminder of a central authority. Public ceremonies continued to signal Rome's enduring presence, but this authority was hollow. The titles and offices outlasted the actual ability to govern. Loyalty was no longer ideological, it was transactional. People obeyed when it was convenient or profitable. The empire didn't continue because it was strong. It continued because people had adapted to living within its decaying structures. And so, we arrive at the quiet, almost anticlimactic end of the Western Roman Empire. There was no single, decisive moment, no one battle or event that instantly erased centuries of authority. Instead, the decline was measured in the gradual erosion of habits and capabilities. It was the slower response to each new crisis. It was the government's fading ability to enforce its will in the provinces. It was the increasing reliance on outsiders to defend Roman lands. Authority still existed in name, but it no longer reached where it was supposed to. But here is the most fascinating part. Rome's influence survived its own collapse. In fact, its influence spread even further in its absence. The legal codes, the administrative practices, the models of urban planning, the religious institutions, and the cultural norms, all these things persisted long after the last emperor faded into history. What truly fell was not Rome itself, but the illusion that a single, centralized power could control everything. Life simply continued within the structures the empire had built, and those structures were inherited, reused, and repurposed by the new kingdoms that rose from the ashes. This is the ultimate lesson from Rome's long twilight. It taught the world how to live with decline, not as a catastrophe, but as a slow, quiet process of transformation. The empire ended by becoming routine, by surviving in habit rather than in power, by existing more as a powerful memory than as a physical force. In the end, Rome's legacy stretched far beyond its military might or its political authority, shaping the world we live in today in ways we rarely even notice. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, its eastern counterpart stood resilient, a vast territory stretching from the warm Mediterranean to the forbidding Black Sea. Constantinople, the new capital, was a beacon of ambition. Built upon the enduring memory of Roman greatness, it became the heart of a civilization that refused to die. Yet, even here, in this bastion of power, the slow, subtle process of transformation had begun. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. The emperor in Constantinople was a figure of immense power, but he was also a symbol, a carefully constructed image. His decrees carried the force of law, but their execution depended on a complex web of intermediaries, generals commanding distant legions, administrators governing far-flung provinces, influential bishops, and local elites. All were essential cogs in the imperial machine. Loyalty was not a given. It was a currency that had to be earned and re-earned every single day. Elaborate rituals, grand ceremonies, and the meticulous management of public perception were the tools of statecraft. The machinery of governance was a marvel of intricacy, yet it was also profoundly fragile. A single poorly judged decision, a minor rebellion in a remote corner of the empire, could send ripples of instability through what appeared to be an unshakable structure. Military strength, of course, remained the bedrock of imperial security, but the legions themselves had changed. The soldiers were no longer citizen farmers defending their homeland. They were professionals, often mercenaries, and many were foreigners drawn from beyond the frontiers. Their allegiance was less to the abstract idea of Rome and more to their commanders, to the promise of consistent pay and the spoils of war. The borders were defended, yes, but often through painstaking diplomacy and strategic alliances as much as through brute force. The empire that had once demanded unquestioning obedience now survived through adaptation, compromise, and negotiation. Economically, the Eastern Empire was a powerhouse, far surpassing the prosperity the West had known in its final centuries. The trade routes of the world converged on Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. Its ports bustled with ships from distant lands, its markets overflowed with exotic goods, and its gold currency, the solidus, was the standard of international commerce. But this great wealth, like political power, was a double-edged sword. It bred complacency and vulnerability, inefficiency and corruption, like a slow-acting poison, quietly eroded the foundations of stability. The administration grew ever more complex, burdened by the immense task of maintaining centuries-old systems across vast and diverse territories. This sprawling bureaucracy was both the empire's savior and its trap. It preserved the state, but its sheer complexity made it susceptible to mismanagement, creating fault lines of fragility in every province. Religion became a powerful new force, reshaping the very nature of authority. With Christianity now the official state religion, it provided a new, unifying identity for the empire's diverse peoples. The emperor was no longer just a political and military leader. He was God's regent on earth, the defender of the true faith. His role was to mediate between the divine will and the messy reality of earthly governance. Church councils, theological debates, and grand religious festivals became central to imperial life. They reinforced the emperor's legitimacy, but they also consumed vast resources and diverted attention. Spiritual authority increasingly stood in for the raw, coercive power that had once been enough. Culture, too, became an instrument of endurance. The great legal traditions of Rome were systematically codified under emperors like Justinian, creating a legacy that would shape legal systems for 1,000 years. Education in the classical tradition continued, and magnificent works of architecture, like the Hagia Sophia, rose to dominate the skyline of Constantinople. These monuments, both sacred and secular, served as constant reminders of continuity, of a civilization that persisted against the tides of war and political turmoil. Citizens were educated to remember their Roman heritage, to see themselves as part of an unbroken chain stretching back to Augustus. Even as the political reality shifted around them, they lived within habits and structures that transcended the reign of any single emperor. And yet, this remarkable endurance did not mean the Eastern Empire was invulnerable. Far from it. Threats pressed in from every direction. The formidable Sasanian Persians to the east were a constant rival. Nomadic groups like the Huns, and later the Avars and Slavs, pushed against the northern frontiers on the Danube. And in the 7th century, a new, dynamic force emerged from the south, the Arab armies, united by faith, which would permanently redraw the map of the world. Each crisis was met with a characteristic blend of resilience and adaptation. New fortifications were built, tribute was paid, alliances were forged, but each new threat also exposed the inherent limits of imperial control. The great lesson of the East is this: survival is not just about strength, it's about flexibility. Authority is not maintained by force alone, but through perception, ritual, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call Byzantium, managed to survive for another 1,000 years, not because it was an unstoppable force, but because it had mastered the art of subtlety. It learned to bend so it would not break, even as it projected an image of eternal continuity. The empire lived in the shadow of its own magnificent past. Everyone from the emperor on his throne to the general on the frontier, to the bureaucrat in his office was keenly aware that the structures they relied upon were ancient, built long before their time. The emperor's power was real, but so was the unspoken understanding that the golden age of Rome had already begun to fade, generation by generation, in a slow, graceful decline. The memory of the fallen West lingered like a ghost, a cautionary tale that influenced every major decision, a source of both inspiration and melancholy. Constantinople became a living museum, a testament to the idea that Rome never truly disappears. It transforms, it adapts, and somehow, it endures. As the ages turned, the once mighty Eastern Roman Empire found itself changing its tune. The grand symphony of conquest quieted down, replaced by a more somber melody of survival. The primary business was no longer about expanding frontiers, but about holding the line. Defending borders, managing sprawling cities, and maintaining armies became the day-to-day reality. Power itself had undergone a subtle transformation. It was no longer about the raw, overwhelming force that had once carved out the empire. Instead, it became a delicate balancing act. An emperor might sit on the throne, but his rule was a constant negotiation. He had to keep one eye on his ambitious generals, another on his sprawling bureaucracy, and a third on the mood of his subjects. Authority was real, but it was never absolute. It was a tightrope walk over a sea of competing interests. For the average citizen, life was governed by a predictable rhythm. People woke up, went to work, attended their places of worship, and paid their taxes. The vast, slow-moving currents of history that were shaping their world often flowed unnoticed beneath the surface of their daily lives. The immense machinery of the state, the administration that had been Rome's hallmark, continued to run with its old precision, but its function had changed. It had become reactive. New laws, tax reforms, and military campaigns were almost always responses to immediate crises and invasion. A famine, a revolt rather than parts of a grand, proactive vision for the future. The ghost of Rome's former grandeur lingered in its magnificent structures, in its laws, and its ceremonies, but the spontaneity, the driving ambition, was gone. Even in the prosperous East, the seeds of decline were quietly sprouting. The economy, once the engine of the Mediterranean, began to show signs of strain. The legendary legions were increasingly filled not by Roman citizens, but by mercenaries and foreign auxiliaries whose loyalty was often to their paymaster, rather than the empire itself. Far-flung provinces, once tightly controlled, began to drift, their connections to the capital growing more tenuous, and like a persistent weed, corruption crept into the cracks of the administration, growing alongside the honest diligence of countless officials. The illusion of total control was meticulously maintained, but the reality was that the empire's continued existence depended on adaptation, on constant negotiation, and ultimately, on the willing compliance of the millions it claimed to rule. Survival was now the ultimate prize, and survival demanded compromise at every turn. In this new reality, the empire found its anchors not in military might, but in something deeper: its culture, its laws, and its faith. What bound a citizen to the empire wasn't just the fear of the state's power, but a powerful combination of habit, shared memory, and a common identity. Schools diligently taught the principles of Roman law and recounted the glorious history of the Republic and the early empire. The church became a powerful institution, enforcing not just religious doctrine, but a comprehensive moral and social order that touched every aspect of life. Deep-rooted traditions served as a constant reminder to the people that they were part of something ancient, something far older and grander than themselves. Rome was alive. It lived in the arches and domes of its architecture, in the emperor's face stamped on its coins, in the Latin and Greek spoken in its courts, and in the solemnity of its public ceremonies. It lived on long after its emperors had ceased to be the primary shapers of destiny. This decline had become invisible, a slow, creeping transformation that was difficult to perceive in the course of a single lifetime. People didn't wake up one day and think, "The empire is in decline." Why would they? The machinery still functioned. Authority, while more symbolic, was still present. Laws were on the books. Even if their enforcement varied wildly from one province to another, soldiers still marched under Roman eagles and obeyed their commanders. Even if their ultimate loyalty was more personal than patriotic, taxes were collected. Though the process was often uneven and fraught with local complications, life simply carried on, contained within the magnificent structures built centuries earlier, structures that now seemed more permanent than the dynasties that came and went. The empire had become a framework, a context for life, rather than an active, driving force. Even the magnificent city of Constantinople, the jewel of the East, a fortress that seemed eternal, carried the immense weight of its history more heavily than it held the certainty of its present. Its citizens, its soldiers, its bureaucrats, they all understood, on some level, that they were living participants in a grand, living memory, not just cogs in an actively expanding empire. The East had masterfully preserved the essence of Rome, its culture, and its administrative genius, while quietly acknowledging the new limits of its power. It was an empire that had learned the difficult art of survival without absolute control. Meanwhile, the West remained a ghost. Its political collapse hadn't been a single, cataclysmic event, but a quiet, almost imperceptible fading away. But even as a ghost, its influence was incredibly potent. It persisted everywhere. The law codes of the new barbarian kingdoms were based on Roman precedents. The layouts of new towns and cities often followed Roman planning. Christianity, the religion of the late empire, became the dominant faith of the new Europe. The languages of the people, the Romance languages, evolved directly from the Latin of the soldiers and administrators. Daily habits, cultural norms, and ways of thinking all carried fragments of Roman civilization into these new, emerging societies. The new kings, bishops, and warlords were, in a sense, the inheritors of the scattered remnants of a civilization that had stopped expanding, but had never truly disappeared. And this, perhaps, is Rome's final, most profound lesson. Empires don't just vanish in a flash of fire and a cloud of smoke. They don't die in a single, climactic battle. They disappear slowly, piece by piece. They fade away in the evolution of daily habits, in the transformation of institutions, in the blending of cultures, and in the recesses of memory. Authority withers and blows away like dust, but influence, that intangible residue, endures for centuries. Civilization is not a static thing. It adapts, it reconfigures, and it absorbs. It lives on. Long after the great men and their grand titles who first created it are gone, Rome does not die. It simply drifts, quietly, endlessly, into the lives of all of us who have inherited its world, often without ever realizing it. Have you ever wondered how an empire dies? We imagine a spectacular collapse, don't we? Cities burning, armies clashing, a dramatic final scene. But for Rome, the greatest empire the West had ever known, the end was something else entirely. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a long, slow exhale, a quiet fading that, in many ways, has never truly ended. Today, we're going to look past the Hollywood version of Rome's fall and discover the truth. It's a story far more fascinating and far more relevant to our own world. A story not of collapse, but of transformation. A story of how an empire can disappear from the map, yet remain all around us, shaping our lives in ways we barely notice. Let's begin by setting the stage. By the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. The traditional date for its fall is for 76 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustus, was deposed. But on the ground, for the average person, did the world feel like it had ended? Not really. The sun still rose. Farmers still planted their crops. Merchants still traveled the roads, the very roads Rome had built. This is the first crucial point. Rome's authority didn't vanish overnight. It just became a blurry. Think of it like a company whose CEO has left, but the departments keep running on their own, following old procedures out of habit. In Gaul, in Spain, in Britain, Roman-style administration continued, but now it was run by local strongmen, barbarian kings, or bishops of the rapidly growing Christian church. They weren't necessarily trying to destroy Rome. In many cases, they were trying to be the new Rome. They adopted Roman titles, issued coins that mimicked Roman designs, and governed using Roman law because it was simply the best system available. The brand was so powerful, it outlived the corporation. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire didn't fall at all. It simply carried on, centered in the magnificent new capital of Constantinople. We call it the Byzantine Empire today, but they called themselves Romans. Their emperors were the direct successors to Augustus and Constantine. They preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology for another 1,000 years. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really only talking about the western half. The Eastern Empire was a living, breathing continuation of Roman civilization, adapting and evolving with the times. It proves that Rome wasn't a monolith, it was an idea, capable of changing its shape and location to survive. But let's return to the West, to the city of Rome itself. The once bustling heart of the world, a metropolis of over 1 million people, slowly shrank. Its grand monuments, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, stood as silent witnesses to a bygone era. Yet, the city wasn't abandoned. It found a new purpose. It became the center of the Christian faith, with the Pope stepping into a role that was, in many ways, modeled on the Roman emperor. He became a spiritual emperor. The administrative structures of the empire, its dioceses and provinces, were repurposed by the church. The language of the empire, Latin, became the language of scholarship, law, and worship across Europe for centuries. Rome, the political capital, was gone. But Rome, the spiritual and cultural capital, was just beginning. This is the secret to Rome's quiet endurance. Its systems were just too good to let go of. Roman law, with its principles of evidence, contracts, and property rights, formed the bedrock of nearly every legal system in Europe. When you hear phrases like innocent until proven guilty or burden of proof, you are hearing the echoes of Roman courtrooms. Look at our cities, the classic grid layout, the focus on public spaces, the engineering of aqueducts and roads. These are all Roman concepts that influenced urban planning for 2 millennia. The languages we speak, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are direct descendants of. The Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and merchants, even English, a Germanic language, is filled with thousands of words derived from Latin. Words like Senate, Republic, Justice, Liberty. These are not just words. They are Roman ideas that we have inherited. The decline was so subtle, it was almost invisible to those living through it. An emperor's authority might fade in a distant province, but the local governor, using Roman methods, still collected taxes. The imperial army might dissolve, but local warlords organized their own troops into legions and cohorts. Because it was the most effective military structure known, coins with the emperor's face might become rare, but people continued to use them, valuing them as currency long after the emperor himself was a distant memory. Civilization didn't end, it just reorganized, it atomized. The vast, centralized network of the empire broke down into smaller, local networks. But each of those small networks still ran on Roman software. The empire became a ghost in the machine, its influence persisting in the habits, laws, and beliefs of the generations that followed. They lived inside Roman structures without even realizing it. Like fish unaware of the water they swim in. Think about the sheer staying power of the idea of Rome. For centuries after the Western Empire was gone, kings and rulers across Europe would claim the title of Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne did it. The Holy Roman Emperors in Germany did it. Napoleon did it. Even the Tsars of Russia, through the title Caesar, claimed a connection to that ancient lineage. Why? Because Rome represented the ultimate model of order, power, and civilization. It was the standard against which all subsequent Western powers measured themselves. So, the story of Rome's fall is not one of dramatic endings. It's a story of endless, subtle continuation. The authority of the emperors disappeared, but their influence is woven into the fabric of our world. The empire did not crash, it dissolved, seeping into the soil of Europe to fertilize the civilizations that would grow in its place. Rome teaches us that the most powerful things are not armies or emperors, but systems, ideas, and culture. These are the things that truly last. They can outlive any government, any dynasty, any single moment in history. And so, Rome rests. It sleeps, not in a tomb, but all around us, in the words we speak, in the laws that govern us, in the layout of our cities, and in the very idea of a Western world. Its decline is endless because its legacy is eternal. Rome is not dead. It's just background noise, a quiet, persistent hum that has shaped our world for 2,000 years. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time.